Good morning. A very warm welcome to St Peter Mancroft Church. I'm Fiona Howarth, the Associate Priest here. It's a real delight to welcome Dr. Adrian Marsden here for our Heritage Open Day talk. Adrian is no stranger to St Peter Mancroft, so it's really a welcome back. Thank you. Adrian is a numismatist at Norfolk County Council, and his talk this morning is of tokens and trade. What did we do when the small change ran out? And I'm delighted to say that Adrian has also brought a book on 17th century tokens in Norwich Castle Museum, which is at the back, and they are for sale. So if you're particularly interested in the topic, there will be an opportunity for you to delve into it much further after the talk, but I'm sure Adrian will mention that as part of his session this morning. So thank you very much, and without further ado, I will hand over to Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Can you all hear me? Yes. Good. I'd also like to thank Edward and Chris for inviting me to come along and talk to you today. And so, here we go. Today's talk, as you know, is going to be about tokens. Now, all these tokens I'm going to be talking about today are intimately connected with St Peter Mancroft. The people who issued them lived here. Many of them were also buried here. And in terms of date, we're looking in the 1650s and 1660s. It's that window we're looking at. So before we start looking at the actual people who issued the tokens, it's probably a good idea to actually discuss why they came into being in the first place. Right, gives you some idea of scale, doesn't it? By 1600, the English coinage is, as it always has been, a silver coinage. There's a bit of gold around, but most is silver. Now, because of the slow effects of inflation over the last 200 or 300 years, what we've got are very small coins. Top left, a halfpenny of Charles I. Bottom left, a half groat, that's 2 pence, the Commonwealth, and then a penny of Charles I and a penny of the Commonwealth. These are small coins. They are difficult to make, so the Royal Mint don't like making them. They're fiddly, you've got to cut a very small die, you're messing around with a tiny disc of silver. So not many are made. They're also very easy to lose, as you can see, something like that. And because they're not easy to make, the Mint prefer to make bigger coins like shillings and so forth. But nonetheless, these coins have a decent value. The English coinage in this period is, as I said, silver and gold. It's non-fiduciary in Latin terms. There's no need to have fides, faith, because it's worth its weight in silver. These tokens come about because there's a shortage of this stuff. As I say, not much made, easy to lose. So when you have the Civil War, production of the small copper coins, farthings, ceases. So by the time Charles I's head is cut off in 1649, there's a chronic shortage of small change. It's very difficult for us to appreciate that, especially now when you're hardly using coins at all, it's all swipe. But it's a very real problem in the past. Obviously, if you've not got enough small change, you've got problems. It really makes trading difficult. So, what do people do? They have their own tokens made. I suppose one thing to talk about is what these things are worth before we carry on. Well, it's a pre-decimal system. So you have a pound, which is probably worth about £1,000 today. It's difficult to ally prices in the past with prices today, but that's roughly what it works out at by probably the best calculations. A pound makes up 20 shillings, so a shilling, probably the equivalent of about a £50 note, and 12 pennies make up a shilling. So that means a penny is worth roughly 4 or 5 quid in today's currency. A halfpenny, say a couple of pounds, and that makes a farthing token, and these are all farthings, these tokens, the equivalent of about a pound. So it's a reasonable sum of money. There's nothing smaller. They don't have really low value coins in the 17th century. A farthing is as low as you can get. Right, so we've seen there's a currency shortage, and so people make their own, or more correctly, they have their own made. And this is a typical handful of farthing tokens from the 1650s and 1660s. You will send to London and they will make an order out for you and then send them back, and you use them as change. You will give them as change in your shop, for example. Let's look at a few typical examples now, before we go further. These are all issuers who lived in the parish of St. Peter Mancroft, but they're not ones I'll be talking about later, but they're good to show you what a token is like. You can see the size. They're about 16 millimetres, so about 2/3 of an inch in old money. And they carry the name of the issuer, in this case George Reeves. They carry a blazon on the obverse, that's the head side. It's not got a head, but it is the obverse. And these blazons will replicate signboards, for example, an inn sign or just a signboard advertising business, because you don't have street numbers in the 17th century, so you have these signs hanging above shops, so you can see what you're going to buy. In this case, this is the arms of a Worshipful Grocers Company of London. Now, that applies to grocers everywhere across the country. So George Reeves is a grocer, and that shield would probably have decorated his signboard so that everybody could see what they were going in to buy. And then in Norwich, no surprise there. And then you have here a triad of initials, this is known as, and this is a standard thing in the past. We have R for Reeve at the top, and then G for George, and the R is the initial of his wife. In this case, we know his wife was called Ruth. Not all token issuers put their wife's initial on. Some are a bit chauvinistic, but most do. So if you've got that initial, obviously it helps when you're doing your research. Another one, Peter Deal. We know that Peter Deal was an armourer and a cutler, a maker of blades, and so on his token he's got this little helmet, and again his sign would probably have had a helmet on outside his shop. Peter Deal, these things are made in London, and in any case there's no standardised spelling in the 17th century, so what you have are often mistakes in spelling. You've probably got maybe some of a strong Norwich accent going to London, telling the Cockneys in the Tower Mint what they want on their token. You can imagine the problems. So here we've got Peter with 2 E's, and the name is often spelt Dale in the records, not Deal. And then in Norwich, PD, Peter Deal, and his wife was called Amy. Finally, Richard Morant, that's it. Richard Morant. He's a worsted weaver, we know that. Doesn't put his wife's initial on, although he is married. Sadly, Morant's family all died of a plague in 1666 and were buried here. And finally, your last sort of starter for 10, Violet Benton with a key. Benton is actually a very wealthy linen draper. Violet is his name. His wife is Rebecca. Now, we know from his probate inventory, when his goods are being assessed, that he leaves an awful lot of cloth. He leaves hundreds of pounds worth of cloth. That's then, so hundreds of thousands of pounds of cloth in today's money. So they're 4 typical tokens. Well, what to say about 17th century tokens in the past? We know that the first collector, or the first collector we know of, was a chap called Brown Willis, who was collecting in the very early 18th century. Sadly, not everybody was so keen. John Evelyn is very prophetic, and he writes, "The tokens may happily in after time come to exercise and busy the learned critic what they should signify, and fill whole volumes with their conjectures." Indeed, many, many, many volumes have been filled on these things. Pinkerton is not quite so nice. "These town pieces and tradesmen's tokens are collected by some antiquaries with an avidity truly puerile. I will venture to say that their workmanship is always utterly contemptible, and that not one purpose of taste, information, or curiosity can be drawn from them." And he continues, "It need hardly be added that they are recommended to the supreme scorn of the reader, who may justly regard the studying or collecting them, along with the admiration of counters, as beneath any man of taste." Well, that's told me, hasn't it? I am a token anorak. I will hope to prove Pinkerton wrong in the course of my talk today. Anyway, so there we are. They are a bit more well thought of now. Right, let's begin with Norwich in the period. We do have rather a nice sort of bird's eye view here of Norwich from the west, looking over, and you can see the various landmarks with castle and cathedral. So a nice bird's eye view, 1661, slap bang in the period we're looking at. And then if you spin that aerial view round and have a map here, you have the Wensum flowing through, you have the northern wards at the top, the ultra aquam, that area across the river, across the water, and then south of the river, and indeed west of it, you have St. Peter Mancroft, the parish of St. Peter Mancroft here. It, of course, borders the market in part, and this is the market area. Now, before we carry on, it's probably an idea to look at how much this area has changed. This is, sorry, not yet, Chris. We have the main market now, and then you've got the Over Row, which was St. Peter Street, and then the Never Row, Gentleman's Walk, St. Peter Mancroft here, and the livestock market used to be here. Let's look at the area now. This is the market area now, massively different. You've got the Forum, of course, City Hall, built in 1938, and then the market is pretty much all stalls, and the only two constants, really, linking the market area today, as it was in the 1650s and 1660s, is Mancroft itself and the Guildhall. We will look at the Guildhall later. Right, let's go back to one of the earliest maps we have here. This is Hoyle's map of 1728. You can see the market very different. You've got lots of buildings here, which we'll come back to in a minute, and you have this great big monstrosity here. This is not quite to scale, because as you see it's as big as St. Peter Mancroft, but this was a very big thing. It was indeed the market cross, and this is 60 or 70 feet high, and this stands at the bottom end, or stood at the bottom end of the market. It's demolished in 1732, which is why it appears on Hoyle's map of 1728, but not on King's map of 1766. You can see it's gone. But that may have gone, but the rest of the market is still very alien compared to today. You've got all these buildings here, slap bang in the centre of what's now the marketplace. You've got St. Peter Street here, obviously City Hall long, long in the future, and the Forum long in the future as well. This is a view about 1800 from the top of the market, basically top of the Guildhall, looking south to Mancroft. And then this is actually the fish market, or was the fish market at the time. That occupies the higher ground just below where City Hall now stands. And finally, well, not quite finally, we'll go through a sort of quick survey of what happens. This is an aerial view of the market in the 1920s. I'm grateful to Jonathan Plunkett, who has generously allowed me to use his late father George's photographs, which you can also find out online. You can see all these houses here, swinging round, encircling Mancroft, by coming right up to the gates of Mancroft, and then the Guildhall here, and then all these big buildings. They go the way of all flesh. This is the buildings in the early 30s. You can see St. Peter's Street behind. This is pre-City Hall. And then all those houses are demolished, so you've got this great swathe of land here, which will become City Hall. This is just before 1938. You've still got all those buildings, however. That changes shortly. Oh, sorry, Chris, could we have the last one again? All these houses survive until 1961. We'll come back to those shortly. And here we have these big buildings in the centre of the market being demolished. This is in 1938. You can see City Hall has been put up by this time. And then continuing to be demolished, and you can see the Guildhall here. So this gives you an idea of where these buildings are located. Right, so that's what the area looks like. So let's now start to look at some of the people who lived in Mancroft and were, as I say, often buried there. You've got an awful lot of sources to go at here. You've got parish records, baptisms, marriages and burials. They're obviously quite useful, so you can track these people down. Remember, if you have one of those tried of initials with the wife's initial on, that's quite useful. You have the mayoralty court books. These are big books in the Norfolk Record Office in the Archive Centre, where all the decisions of the Court of Mayoralty, which is headed by the mayor and including the alderman and Common Council, they meet and they pass judgments on people or building regulations, all sorts of things like that. So some of those can be very interesting. There's the half-tax assessments. They're assessed for Norwich in 1666, and basically you are taxed £1 on every half you have in your house. So it's an attempt at a sort of wealth tax. The bigger the house, the more halves you've got, the more you should pay. It's replaced by the equally unpopular window tax in William III's reign, where, as you can guess, you're taxed on your windows. There are also wills and other probate records. They can be very interesting indeed. Obviously, a will is telling you how someone is disposing of their property after their death. And you can also get things like probate inventories, where all the possessions of the deceased are listed. They're far less common, but they sometimes survive. And then there's lots of other contemporary records. For example, registers of the freedom of the city. If you're starting in trade, and this only applies to men in this period, you need to have the freedom of Norwich to trade. You can trade for 2 years and a day without it, but then you must have the freedom. This is basically signalling someone starting out their career, usually, although some people put the freedom off as long as they can. So there's all sorts of things to go at. We'll leave that there for now. But the Norfolk Record Office, as you might guess, has stacks of stuff relating to Norwich, and some of that relates to the token issuers themselves. So, right, let's have a survey now, a tour, if you like, round St. Peter Mancroft in the 1650s and 1660s, and actually meet some of these people. The first one we have here, O'Parker, John Parker, a lamb, and of Norwich, 1665, and we know from the records that his wife was E. Now, for lamb on the token, and this is where the lamb is now. Now, I have mixed feelings on this place. Still in operation. It's very nice on one hand to have a tavern or an inn that was a base for a tokenist who are still in operation, but I did pay my first £5 for a pint in that place. It is rather on the expensive side. But it does survive. It's one of only 2 pubs that do. The other is the Adam and Eve on the other side of the city. But John Parker, the lamb, references the inn sign, or what would have been the inn sign of the lamb. But Parker wasn't the licensee, and this is something we need to look at briefly. Not all licensees issue tokens, and not all token issuers are licensees. Indeed, quite often, a token issuer might be based somewhere, operating maybe out of the back or conducting their business from a shop there, but they're not actually in charge of the place. So the lamb is the base of John Parker, but he's not actually running the pub. We know that Parker is a mercer. Now, mercers in this period are sort of top-end wholesalers. They're supplying reasonably good, expensive items. They stand above grocers who are wholesalers dealing with more common sort of stuff, and haberdashers who are similar. So, yeah, mercers are sort of top-end, and Parker is one of those. Augustine Briggs. Now, the token says Augustine Briggs, if you look. There's a D. This is an error at the Tower of London where these tokens were made. It should be Briggs. Now, Briggs is an interesting character. He's born in 1617. He's apprenticed in Norwich. And then, while he's sort of finishing off his apprenticeship, the Civil War breaks out. And Briggs, in contrast to most people in Norwich who are very much for Parliament, goes off to fight for the king. And he's present at the siege of King's Lynn in 1643. The royalists get beaten there. So Briggs comes back to Norwich with his tail between his legs. And, well, he surely keeps his head down. We know he's not punished for it. Cousins Hardy and Kent, in their book on the mayors of Norwich, they say that he's stripped of his aldermanship, or his aldermanry. That's not the case, because he's only 25. He's far too young to be an alderman in the first place. And indeed, he's not an alderman until much, much later. But he does get himself elected onto a common council in 1656. So he's obviously not that inimical to the Corporation of Norwich during the Commonwealth. But it is in 1660 of the Restoration that his star really comes into the ascendant. He's made sheriff in that year, in 1660, with the Restoration of Charles II, and 10 years later he's mayor. And incredibly, we have 2 portraits surviving. He's just about the only token issuer in the country who we have a portrait surviving of, and that's because he's doing very well by 1670. One in his mayoral robes and another dressed as a cavalier, which echoes what one of his contemporaries says about him. He is an honest old cavalier and a very understanding man. We will see shortly that he actually wasn't quite that understanding with some people. But he does very well. He is mayor, as I say, in 1670. He's MP for Norwich, one of the 2 MPs in the late 1670s and early 1680s. And then he dies in 1684. His tomb, or rather his war memorial, is there. And on it you have letters picked out in lead. It's rather impressive monument. And in Latin, part of it translating as the good genius of the city and county of the Iceni, a man of honest report, sound judgment and wise understanding, an approved example of piety, charity and sociability. And Briggs does very nicely because he has a street named after him. Briggs Street, you know where this is presumably. You're going out down that way. It wasn't always called Briggs Street. It was originally called Briggs Lane. In the early 19th century, the S is dropped and it becomes a street rather than a lane, but named after Briggs because his house stood there, so the street comes to bear his name. So Briggs does rather well. Brockton is a different character entirely. Brockton is a bit of a scoundrel, really. He could, I suppose, be called a pragmatic businessman. It's up to you. No one for many years knew what the castle signified. They said it might be part of the arms of Norwich, which has a castle and then a lion, or it could refer to an inn sign. That's correct. But it wasn't until I went to the Norfolk Record Office and had a random search that I found out why. Look at his career briefly first, in Norwich. Wife are another Rebecca. He becomes free in 1636. He takes on a few apprentices. He starts as a haberdasher, sometimes described as a milliner, so a sort of rather low-end tradesman. And then as his career progresses, he starts to change his title, and he ends up describing himself as a mercer, and then finally in his will, which is proved in 1680, he is styled gentleman. Now, this is the same as Briggs, and basically if you do very well in trade, you can basically buy yourself land and buy yourself gentility on the back of that. So Brockton does this, but his earlier career is not quite so glorious. First of all, he gets in trouble. This is where the castle was, but let's look at a document first. This is the document I found. This is a court summons, and it is summoning James Brockton, or Brogden as he's called in the document, to court in 1655. What's he done wrong? Well, he has behaved very naughtily because he obviously owns the castle, this inn. And what he's been doing is for the last year, he has been taking in overnight paying guests. Now, you have to be licensed as an ancient inn to do that. You can't just set up and do it. And there are 2 inns in the neighbourhood which have that right. And they're obviously a bit miffed at James Brockton taking, starting up competition. We'll look at them in turn. But first, here we have it. It mentions James Brogden of Norwich, haberdasher of small wares. And then one common inn called the Castle. Common inn, not an ancient inn. We don't know what happens to Brockton, but plainly he gets out of it because he's got the castle on his token, which is dated 1664, so, as you saw. So he's plainly got out of it, and whether the castle is allowed to take paying overnight guests by then or not, we don't know. But it does certainly turn into a hotel, because this is a castle hotel later on. This is Second World War. You can see a little barrage balloon and then an American officer in the foreground. But that's the frontage of the Castle Hotel. If you remember the little map, the original entrance is on White Lion Street. This is the later entrance when it comes out onto the area below the castle mound. So the entrance is changing, but the back entrance still remained. This is earlier this century. You can make that Castle Hotel. That's the place. So it survived until relatively recently. It was knocked down in 1989 to make way for the castle now. And that's what stands there now. That's the old Hart Foundation, where electricity and furniture shop. So the castle survived, as I say, until pretty recently. Let's look at the other places. And this is one ancient inn called the Blue Bell. Now, no one, as far as we know, issued a token at the Blue Bell, but it does still stand. It's now that rather awful Wetherspoons pub on Hog Hill, later Orford Hill. But it's still the same place. Now, of course, it looks nothing like it would have done. It's been wholly, the inside's been stripped out to put all those awful neon lights and things in, and the exterior was heavily rebuilt in the 19th century, so it looks nothing like it would have done. But it is on the place where the Blue Bell was. So that's the Blue Bell, and the other one called the White Lion. Now, the White Lion was on White Lion Street. It gives White Lion Street its name. It was White Lion Lane then, again, like with Briggs, it was a lane, not a street at the time. The White Lion, we are fortunate, also housed a token issuer. Again, he's not the licensee. He does seem, from all the records I can lay my hands on, to have been a barber, which is a bit odd. But I suppose if you are having a shave or your hair cut, a farthing token to use as chains is perfect, given a shave is probably costing, or a haircut is probably costing a halfpenny or something like that. So he's based there. His wife, Elizabeth, rather annoyingly, his son, who's also called William Money, also marries an Elizabeth. But we know this token is late 1650s stylistically, and we know the son is not old enough to be issuing a token at that stage, so it's the father who's issuing it. And of course, the little lion here is referencing the White Lion, so again, it's a signboard. That's where it is, the White Lion, and you can see it's even marked. This is the King's map we looked at earlier, 1766, and it's marked here White Lion Lane. You can see Mancroft and White Lion Lane. You can see the bell here, which we looked at, and the White Lion is the other ancient inn, which has a right to put people up overnight if they pay. And it's quite probable that Money is one of the people who's a bit annoyed at Brockton usurping that inn's right to take people in. So we don't know, but that's the White Lion for you. Rather nicely, this is another place that survives. Here, it remains the White Lion until 1918. It then becomes the Haymarket Stores, which is another pub, another inn, and that's closed down in 1974. This is a view of it in the 30s. You can see here these two twin gables here at the top, and that's looking away from Mancroft. This is looking towards Mancroft and the marketplace. You can see the two little gables still slightly remodelled, and it was a Costa until very recently. It closed as a Costa just before the lockdown. So it's actually up for let, but it'd be quite nice to let somewhere out that the token issue had lived in, but I think the asking price is rather enormous. So that's the White Lion. We'll look at a rather sadder story now, and this is John Brown. The token shows what you would be forgiven for thinking is a duck here. It is in fact a swan, and it is referencing the White Swan. Now the White Swan is a huge coaching inn right outside the gates of Mancroft. We'll look at the location in a minute. For now, it's enough to know that Brown was married to Susan, strikes the token in 1657. He is born at Brockton in 1629. He marries Susan at some point in the early 1650s, but I've not found a marriage record as yet. But they have their first child, Mary, in 1654, so the token is issued fairly early in his working life. We know from the records that he is a confectioner or sugar baker, so he's making pastries basically. And as I say, the White Swan here. King's map records it, the postcoach to London in one day from the White Swan. So it's coaching him then in 1766. And as you can see, it is right outside the doors of Mancroft. See, here we go back to that aerial view from the 1920s. And you can see here, this white frontage, if you can make it out, that is the frontage of what was the White Swan. You can see it's right up to the ports of Mancroft. In fact, he could probably have lobbed a jam tart from his threshold into the ports. It's that close. Nowadays, if you're standing on the steps of the Forum, you are pretty much where the White Swan was. And indeed, another of George Plunkett's photographs, this one in the courtyard of the old White Swan. It's become a slum by now. This is 1961, just before its demolition. It was demolished to make way for the Central Library, which of course in its turn fell victim to fire, and then the Forum, of course, now occupies the site. But this is the courtyard before it's demolished, and you can see the great Tower of Mancroft in the background. And rather nicely, this is a hint of how high status the White Swan was originally. As I said, it became a slum. But when they're knocking it down, they come across this rather fine medieval cellar here with these vaulted arches. So it was quite a building originally before it began this sad sliding down into a slum. Okay, getting back to poor old John Brown. I mentioned the first child, Mary. She survives to become an adult, although that's not the whole story. They have 11 more children. They all die. And I came across this quite by accident. This is the ledger slab, the floor stone, to Susan Brown, the daughter of John and Susan Brown, and it is right by where my mini exhibition is, if you want to look later. She dies in 1686, aged 19, just short of becoming what would have been an adult at the time. The stone also has a rather nice little poem at the bottom. Here lies a single flower scarcely blown, 10 more before the northern gates are strown. Plucked from the self-same stalk, only to be transplanted to a better nursery. So that's poor Susan and the other 10 children there. They're all buried either with Susan or perhaps outside in the graveyard, outside the northern porch, which is that door there. So, one daughter survives. Now, we do have the will of both John Brown and later of Susan Brown, his widow. Now, what's very sad is in the main body of both wills, there are several complicated sections dealing with looking after their daughter Mary. She is obviously very severely either mentally or physically disabled. She needs looking after, so people are appointed to look after the money that's being left in her name and to look after her. So it's sad that the only surviving daughter has these severe problems. But what was quite nice in Susan Brown's will, the widow, she dies at Brockton. The two of them obviously moved back there to retire effectively. John Brown is described as a gentleman, so he's another of these tokenisters who makes the leap into gentility on the back of all his hard work. But then there's this quite exceptional bit here in the will, and chopping it up to fit the slide. Susan Brown wishes to be decently buried in the parish church of St. Peter of Mancroft in the city of Norwich, as near my daughter Susan as may be. In other words, right over there. Significantly, She doesn't want to be buried with her husband, who we know was buried at Brockton. She wants to be brought back to St Peter Mancroft to lie close to her, one of her daughters. Right, we move on. The King's Head. William Cooper. King's Head on one side and a rose on the other. We know he wasn't the licensee at the King's Head. That was a Mr. Dysely's. This is where the King's Head was. Knocked down in 1813 to make way for Davy Place, so no longer surviving. It moved and it's now gone. And then you can see the place here. This is a painting from the early 19th century, and you can see it's a coaching in because you've got a coach coming out of the entry, and the King's Head sign there. Cooper is obviously based there. As I say, he's not the licensee. We don't quite know what he did. The Rose might refer to another Rose pub or tavern, which we know is around the corner near the Castle Mound. So it may be that he's got his fingers in two pies and he's advertising both his businesses on the one token. We can't be sure. We know he's buried in Mancroft later on. And then, interestingly, we get another token issuer at that place. This is A.L. His name isn't given, but we can be fairly sure that he is the grocer Andrew Lightfoot, who is based at the post office in 1661. Well, the post office in 1661 was at the King's Head, so he's another token issuer based there as well as Cooper. He's not running the post office because a bloke called Soverton is the postmaster in 1661. So you've got Dysely's the licensee, Soverton the postmaster, and these two also based there in 1660, 1661. He is another plague victim in 1666. Well, that's the post office. We'll move on now to Lawrence Goodwin at the Golden Camel. And you have a golden camel. L. Goodwin. Now, Lawrence Goodwin starts his career in the 1650s. He's apprenticed as a grocer, but he becomes a confectioner, like John Brown, and indeed they're quite near to one another. He has a long and distinguished career. He fills many civic offices. He's sheriff in 1682. We'll see him acting in that capacity shortly, and mayor in 1697. He lives to the advanced age of 91, and is buried in St Andrews in 1725. We know that he starts off in Mancroft, but he moves to St Andrews by 1666. But he's an apprentice, and he works his way through the civic offices and has a long and quite distinguished career. And the Golden Camel, we believe it was here where Clark's shoe shop now stands at the end of Briggs Street. We believe that's where it was. Now, interestingly, and there's Lawrence Goodwin's tombstone. It's partly covered up by the pews in St Andrews, as indeed are many tombstones here. But that's where it is, and it records him being alderman and sometime mayor. But we have another camel. Now, it's very unlikely there's, say, a red camel or a silver camel or anything. I'm sure this also references the golden camel, but it's another issuer. And this is Anthony Mingay in Norwich. He also is apprenticed as a grocer, but he becomes an apothecary, and so ends up in the medical trade, if you like. He's a very different individual to Goodwin. He's pretty much born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He is apprenticed, does become a trader, but he inherits Curzon's Manor in Swainsthorpe in 1663 and a heap of money. He seems to pretty much give up work, as indeed who wouldn't. And Indeed, he doesn't want to serve in civic offices because they cost money. So he pays £85, that's about, say, £85,000 in today's money, so he doesn't have to, so he can skip the shrievalty, the sheriffdom, and the mayoralty, and serving as alderman and so on. So that's what he does. We know he moves to St Stephen's by 1666, the Golden Camel. That is right slap bang on the border of Mancroft and St Stephen's parishes anyway. So we know both him and Goodwin move away, but we know that they're both in the parish of Mancroft before 1666. So he could have had the Golden Camel, then Goodwin, or vice versa, or perhaps they were both working out of it at the same time. We don't know. Interestingly, Mingay was one of the witnesses to the will of Sir Thomas Browne, the war memorial over there. And he also lives well into his 70s, Mingay. Right, the Guildhall. This was the administrative centre of Norwich before City Hall was built and County Hall. All the running of Norwich is done from here. It's where the aldermen meet, where the Court of Mayoralty meets, the Common Council, all that. And it also has a prison below, which we'll look into shortly. It's also where all the courts meet. So, Quakers, not popular, the Quakers. They're an independent group. They have various differences with the established Protestant church. One of them, perhaps the main one, being they don't believe that ministers are necessary to mediate between you and God. They are unpopular, to say the least. Now, they start to build an assembly house on Goat Lane in 1678. They probably should have kept their heads down because this seems to lead to a persecution in 1682. Now, you remember in 1682 who was sheriff? It's Lawrence Goodwin. This is the sort of things the Quakers are accused of: above ordinances, free will, etc., etc. A lot of these charges levelled at them are of course untrue, but that doesn't mean mud doesn't stick. Goodwin again. Well, Goodwin is sheriff in 1682, as we've seen. So here's the bloke who's charged with bringing the Quakers in. And it's clear that he doesn't like the Quakers on the basis of how he behaves. They're dragged to the Guildhall. Goodwin is punching them in the back. And when he gets there, he says, if His Majesty was of my mind, he would send you all to Jamaica. Now, Jamaica wasn't full of all-inclusive hotels then. It was rather different. Not a nice place to be sent to. It's unfortunate that when the Quakers get to the Guildhall and they're brought up for trial, that the JP presiding is none other than our friend Augustus Briggs. Briggs, as we heard earlier, was described as a very understanding man. That did not extend, however, to Quakers. The Quakers are brought before Briggs, and they hold their hands up to say, we've got no weapons, we're fine, we don't mean any harm. And Briggs replies, you could have pistols in your pockets for aught I know. The Quakers then ask if they might be sent somewhere decent to wait out their period before they're brought to trial. And Briggs says no. He says, if you've got no money, you will go in the hole. Now, what happened in the 17th century, if you wanted decent accommodation in prison, you paid for it. It's as simple as that. The Quakers aren't doing this, so Briggs sends them to the hole. You can visit the hole. It's under the Guildhall. In fact, I went there last year on Heritage Open Week then. You can see it's a vaulted cellar, basically, not unlike the cellar beneath the White Swan. And you can see this is where it is if you're on the outside of the Guildhall. It's down there. 62 of the Quakers are crammed in the hole. Rather ironically, it was deemed unfit for use as a prison in the reign of Elizabeth I, but didn't stop it being reused. Now, I can't find any intimate connection with a token issuer there, but I have got a sort of sidelong one. The only Quaker I know of who issued a token was Charles Reeves. He's a Cordwainer. The token issued in 1664, quite early in his career. We know he's a Quaker because much later on, towards the end of his life, he marries quite a much younger widow in 1698 called Elizabeth Greenwood. And this is the document here. And Quaker fashion, you have a load of witnesses appending their names. So this records the second marriage of the token issuer and Greenwood. And second on that list, you saw it highlighted in the last slide, is Stephen Ames. Now, interestingly, Ames marries the widow of Reeves. Reeves dies very soon after his second marriage, but Ames marries the widow. He's second on the list of witnesses to Reeves' wedding, and interestingly, we know he was in the hole for 2 years, between 1682 and 1684. They keep them languishing there for 2 years, and we know that Stephen Ames was one of them, because he does feature in the records. Reeves doesn't, so Reeves presumably escaped it. One more issuer who starts his career in Mancroft but moves on. He is Jeremy Vinn, Grocer's Arms, token issued in 1657, early in a career which lasts until 1705 when he dies. Rather nicely, his house survives. I said he moved away from Mancroft. He moves to the cathedral precinct. And if you go in by the Etheldreda gate, his house is immediately on your left, on your right rather. This is it. Big, many-gabled thing. And rather nicely, on the gables, you have IVS, I, Jeremy Vinn, and the initial Susan of his third wife, and then 01, and there would have been a 17 there, so built in 1701. Now, I got to reading Vinn's will, and this spurred me on, because you have this section here. It's written on 15th of November 1703. I am credibly informed this is his youngest daughter, his oldest daughter Susan, she is lately married without my approbation and consent. So I thought, So I thought I would go and check. And indeed, 2 days before this will was written, Susan Vinn the younger, his eldest daughter, named after her mother, married John Peter or Jean-Pierre Desbordes at Westminster. 2 days, so someone has hot-footed it from Westminster to sneak on the young couple, and Jeremy Vinn is obviously furious and either writes a will or rewrites his will. Sadly, the couple come back to Norwich, where Susan gives birth to a son named John Peter after his father, but they die. John Peter is actually, he's French, as you can tell, he's a French Huguenot. He came over with William III in 1689, and he's a soldier. He was a captain at this stage. He becomes Lieutenant General in the end and never remarries. He dies at Enfield in the 1740s. So quite a sad story, that. And Jeremy Vinn is buried in the ambulatory of the cathedral, right at the top, and you can go and see his tomb. Interestingly, his wife is buried with him, his youngest daughter, Mary, his son-in-law, John Knights, and other members of the family, but not Susan. His daughter, that is. Okay, I've not mentioned many token issuing women today. That's simply because there are very, very few of them. There are 91 token issuers in Norwich. 3 of them are women. They are all widows carrying on their dead husband's business. Not helped, the 17th century is a fairly chauvinistic age. Women cannot be free of the city, therefore they can't carry on business if they're spinsters or if they're married. They can only do that if they're widows, and they're a widow of a tradesman. That's the case with Anne Munford here. This is produced after Richard Munford, her husband, has died in 1657. Interestingly, Anne Munford carries on his trade as a grocer, and their son, George Munford, also starts out in trade as a grocer. It looks like George thinks he's a bit better than a grocer because he puts a merchant's mark on his token. That's showing you think you're a bit more than a mere grocer. But it looks like Anne is better at business, because we know that when Anne makes her will in 1672, George owes her 100 quid. That's about 100,000 quid in today's money. So it looks like she is the more astute businessman, and George, for all his pretensions to being a merchant, is probably not quite so good. And one other token issuer who's female, Anne Munford is St. Peter Mancroft, so is Blythe Hatton here. Blythe Hatton, a rose, probably referencing the Rose Tavern or Rose Pub where she may have been based. We know she was a worsted weaver, or rather she's the widow of a worsted weaver, and presumably carrying on the worsted weaver's trade. And obviously she's a widow, so it's just her 2 initials, BH. Right, we'll end now, or very shortly. We've seen there's plenty of places which are connected with tokenists, so big places. This fine building, various shops or buildings that were once inns or shops where tokenists were based. It's very rare that you can hold something other than the tokens which was intimately connected with a token issuer. There is one example though. This is a token, as you see, of Edward Woodyard, pierced, perhaps for use of a pendant or something like that. And then E.W. Edward Woodyard, 1656, and M for Margaret, his wife. And rather nicely, this survives. This is in the Castle Museum collection, but it is on long-term loan to the Worshipful Company of Grocers in London because it has the Grocer's Arms on it. The token has an abbreviated form, it has the sugarloaf and cloves, but you have here E.W.M. Edward and Margaret Woodyard, and the date 1649, so 7 years before the token was issued. And as you may be aware, there is a little exhibition at the back of the entrance of the church, which tells a few of these stories on paper. If you like, do have a look around. The starting point is actually on the far side, so you start there and go round. And of course there is also Susan Brown's tombstone there as well. And as Fiona mentioned earlier, there's 5 copies of my book and catalogue of the Norwich Castle Museum collection for sale. I can only bring 5, I'm afraid, but the proceeds are to go to the church. And so with that, I will say thank you very much.
Well, I'm Chris Sallam. I'm the events manager here at St Peter Mancroft, or coordinator, and it falls to me to offer a vote of thanks to Adrian this afternoon. Adrian, I don't think you are an anorak, really. You've got one heck of an amount of enthusiasm, and you get it over to us in such an easy way to understand as well. So thank you so much for your time and in enlightening us to all these different names, taking us back to the 1650s and 1660s and talking about old bits of Norwich, showing us where these people lived. It was fascinating to see the old maps of the city and also relating to them, how they relate to our city we see ourselves today. Also, of course, it was interesting to hear the very sad tale about Susan. And if you would like to look at her memorial, you'll find the memorial at the end of Adrian's exhibition at the back of the church. As we all know, the Heritage Open Day talks have been going on this week. It's been really wonderful to be able to offer them during the present climate, and we hope to do lots more things depending on what the rules are week by week in the months that lie ahead. But if you would like to show your appreciation for today's Heritage Talk, you might like to leave some tokens of appreciation, you are allowed to groan, in the plastic box at the back, where we are very happy to take plastic notes as well. Do go home safely. We'd ask you to take your time as you leave, and just if you would exit through the north door, which is to my right and your left, and there's sanitizer on the way out. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's really lovely to have the stories to go with it.
Could you exchange these tokens for the place they came from? Could you use them as currency anywhere?
I think they're accepted pretty widely.
Right, okay.
Yeah. It's a very good question. It's one that people are still arguing about, but you get them turning up all over, so they don't go that far, but that's probably because people don't go that far.
You weren't just
No.
It's not like a voucher or something. You had to do it from the same place that you got it